in the larger scheme of things? What should be their approach? And how can humanities contribute towards sustaining the values of human life while dealing with an exigency? The questions I wish to raise in this session are: can humanities play a crucial role in promoting an ethical representation of events? And how can the constituents that make up the spirit of humanities, that is, critical thought, daring imagination, empathetic understanding of the human experiences of many different kinds, understanding the complexity of the world we live in, how can these be played out in the context of the pandemic? Dr. Manoj, can I have the first slide, please? If you're there, can the first slide come on the screen? Can the first slide come on the screen, please? Okay. Okay, if there's an issue with it. So while dealing with the questions of the pandemic, I would like to look back on the reflections of certain scholars over the years. In the 20th century, Rabindranath Tagore, in his essay Nationalism, which was written in 1917, he said, history, and I quote Rabindranath Tagore, history has come to a stage when a moral man, the complete man, is more and more giving way almost without knowing it to make room for the commercial man, the man of limited purpose. This process is assuming gigantic proportion and power, causing the upset of man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization. We see here that Rabindranath Tagore gives more importance to the moral man as compared to the commercial man. Now, although this was written 100 years back, this is relevant even today. If we have the next slide, I would have liked it on the screen. The next slide is also a reflection by Rabindranath Tagore. While I quote, while making use of material possessions, and I may add technology or technological apparatuses in this case, man has to be careful to protect himself from their tyranny. If he is weak enough to grow smaller to fit himself into his covering, then it becomes a process of gradual suicide by shrinkage of the soul. So even way back in 1917, Rabindranath Tagore had expressed apprehensions that material possessions and technology will take over and completely obliterate what can be called the soul of man. It will cause the soul of man to completely shrink. If we had the slides, I would like the third slide. And in the third slide, I'm quoting Hillis Miller, one of the giant intellectuals of the 20th as well as the 21st century. And he wrote in 2016, the humanities in our universities, trade schools teaching primarily STEM subjects that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, to prepare students for a work in a technologized, digitized, and commoditized society. Now, the apprehensions which were expressed by Rabindranath Tagore 100 years back, these were playing out in our universities in 2016 or in the 21st century. And Hillis comes to denote the sort of thing that a well-planned machine can do better than a human being can. And the main effect of education, the achieving of a life of rich significance, drops by the wayside. So all these show that humanities is probably being sidelined in schools and universities. And Hillis Miller continues, he says that it is extremely difficult to demonstrate that humanities departments bring any financial return at all. He calls it bang for the buck, or that majoring in English is preparation for anything but a low-level service job or a low-paying job teaching English. Now, the problem is that Today's world is increasingly data-driven, and even UGC, it keeps on asking for outcomes. It keeps on asking for physical or tangible output in terms of education. So when you are asked to provide a tangible outcome in terms of a job or self-employment, humanities finds it a little difficult to very easily translate the knowledge in terms of money. So that is a problem with humanities, and that is possibly why even the funding opportunities in humanities, that is much less compared to the funding opportunities in, shall we say, science and commerce. These apprehensions and concerns are reflected by Martha Nussbaum also. And she says, I quote, "Radical changes are occurring in what democratic societies teach the young, and these changes have not been well thought through. Thirsty for national profit, nations and their systems of education are heedlessly discarding skills that are needed to keep democracies alive. If this trend continues, nations all over the world will soon be producing generations of useful machines rather than complete citizens who can think for themselves, criticize tradition, and understand the significance of another person's sufferings and achievements." So we have our universities are unfortunately training the students to be more like machines, to produce output, to produce, shall we say, financial gain in one way or the other, at the cost of what can be called critical thinking, um, critical thinking, and understanding the significance of another person's sufferings and achievements. Martha Nussbaum continues, and as far as the radical changes which are taking place, she says, again I quote, "The humanities and the arts are being cut away in university education in virtually every nation of the world. Seen by policymakers as useless frills, they are rapidly losing their place in curricula and also in the minds and hearts of parents and children. Even the humanistic aspects of science and social science, that is the imaginative, creative aspect, and the aspect of rigorous critical thought, are also losing ground as nations prefer to pursue short-term profit by cultivation of the useful and highly applied skills suited to profit making." So we are actually living in an age where humanities is being consistently devalued and being replaced by specific skills which are suited mainly for profit making and not for critical thinking, etc. Manoj, can we have the next slide, please? I think I said all these things, so maybe we can skip 5 or 6 slides. Yeah, that also. This also I have already addressed. This also addressed. Yes. Now, what are the abilities associated with humanities and the arts? The ability to think critically, which I have already mentioned, and the ability to transcend local loyalties and to approach world problems as a world citizen of the world, and not just a local person. And the ability to imagine sympathetically the predicament of another person. These are the abilities which are associated with humanities. And as I said before, these abilities cannot be easily and directly turned into profit-making skills. That is the problem with humanities. So the question is, should education be exclusively for profit-making, or should education aim for a more inclusive type of citizenship? Next slide, please. Now, before we start arguing that this is what all the teachers have been anyway arguing, that education should not only be for profit, we should have a more inclusive type of citizenship. We have been fighting for that for ages, but then that is not being reflected in UGC or in any of the areas associated with higher education. Let's see what UGC envisages. Further improvement of quality of higher education is considered critical for enabling effective participation of young people in knowledge production and participation in the knowledge economy, improving national competitiveness in a globalized world, and for equipping young people with skills relevant for the global and national standards and enhancing the opportunities for social mobility. So the focus here, the emphasis here is on equipping young people with skills relevant for the global and national standards. You are equipping students for employability, perhaps at the cost of critical thinking, as I said earlier. Next slide, please. And in the UGC vision, which is continued, sustained initiatives are required for institutionalizing an outcome-oriented higher education system and enhancing employability of graduates through curriculum reform based on a learning outcomes-based curriculum framework. So UGC is actually promoting an LOCF, or Learning Outcome-Based Curricular Framework, which focuses mainly on employability. Earlier, our education had at least some focus on humanities, liberal arts, etc. And now UGC is actually telling us to reform the curriculum so that the focus is shifted away from liberal arts, focus is shifted away from what we call humanities, and focus is based on the employability skills of the students. So as soon as they come out with a graduate degree or postgraduate degree, whatever, they should be equipped to perform some kind of a job which will make them self-sufficient. See, basically, it's a good thing to make students self-sufficient because basic needs have to be fulfilled, but it should not be at the cost of humanities. It should not be at the cost of critical thinking. UGC continues saying, with technology use and integration to improve teaching learning processes and reach a larger body of students through alternative learning modes such as open and distance learning modes and use of MOOCs. Now, on the surface, this seems like it is going to promote equality among students, and it seems like a very seductive concept that you have with technology, with MOOCs, and with distance learning modes, you can actually access more students, but it also has dangerous. It has a dangerous subtext saying that if you record all these classes on the online platform, you are slowly making the teacher, or at least the large number of teachers or the diversity among the teachers, you are practically moving them towards redundance. And when you move them towards redundance, again, you are actually catering to the market needs and not the needs of higher education. So we have an increasing trend where markets, corporates, etc., are controlling higher education to a great extent. We have so many private universities coming up. I'm very sure that they're doing a very good job. But somewhere, when you have such a large number of private universities, there is a danger of the higher education being controlled by certain corporate interests or interests which have agendas which may or may not be completely conducive to the human vision. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so now, so these were some of the general reflections of scholars. So I come back to my paper. So I say that the universities across the world, by a progressive devaluation of humanities, are training lesser number of people in humanities. This is what happens. In an increasingly technologized, commercialized, and commodified, as well as data-driven world, the humanities represent the ideological, the intangible, and the non-quantifiable. When an attempt is made to reduce everything down to numbers, humanities eludes the framework. This could be the reason why the nation states, corporates, and the drivers of the market regime are uncomfortable with humanity. I think I've not quite read Judith Butler. We can have the previous slide itself. The importance of humanities, the importance of humanities can be measured by what Hillis Miller calls the accuracy with which the literary and non-literary works reflects the world, reflects the real world, or functions as a guide to conduct for readers living in that world. Its role is also to promote among students and public critical thinking that might help them to resist being taken in by the lies with which they are bombarded from all sides these days by the media. He's actually referring to fake news, etc. So critical thinking actually helps the reader to discern between fake news and the genuine. This discernment can be developed through critical inquiry into the representation of events. Humanitarian agencies and practitioners can attempt to reduce the gaps between research, practice, and policy by putting up organized studies and assessments to be converted into helpful actions. Now, when we talk about humanities research, this is where the role of the academia in humanities comes in. You have the academia, you have the media, you have the popular, you have various versions of humanities. And this is where the relevance of the academic branch, that is trying to reduce the gaps between research, practice, and policy. This is where the relevance of the humanities branch of academic branch of humanities comes in. Representation, central to the humanities, thus becomes a primary tool in playing out the politics of what gets projected and what gets obfuscated. Or it is known that representation is a central concern of humanity. The ethical representation can be done through literature's many acts of what Martha Nussbaum calls moral communication. She contends that moral communication partakes both of the specificity and of the emotional and imaginative richness of an individual's efforts and behavior. She also elaborates upon terms like moral perception, which implies a fine development of our human capabilities to see and feel and judge, an ability to miss less, to be responsible for more. So that is her concept of moral perception. We have a habit of sometimes missing out the uncomfortable and focusing only on the comfortable. So humanities leads us towards moral perception, which develops in us the ability to miss less and be responsible for more. While discussing the ethical representation of events, Thomas Lacker proposes the notion of moral imagination, defined as the imagination that allows us to regard the suffering of distant humans as making the same sort of claim on us as the suffering of proximate ones. Usually, the suffering of people who are right in front of us, close to us, that makes an impact on us. But the suffering of proximity, that does not touch us. So Thomas Lacker says that we have to develop moral imagination in order to feel the wrongs suffered by strangers, even if they are at a distance, as strongly as the suffering of the people who are close to us. So Lacker says it is the capacity to feel the exigency of wrong suffered by strangers at a distance. The representation driving the moral imagination could be in the main literary, but cultural texts such as photography, films, and even memes can play a crucial role. So I have taken now to come down to the specifics. So far I have been talking about the general options of humanities. Now I come down to the texts and the study of three texts. In times of national lockdown, which everyone is facing, it is only possible to feel the experience of strangers from a distance. Obviously, we are all cooped up inside the home. While musing on the function of humanities as a response to and reflection of events, I argue that cultural texts cutting across genres in media and focusing on the COVID-19 related situation of migrant labor. I have taken three texts which focused on the travails of the migrant laborers who could not manage the lockdown and because there was no transport, etc., they had to walk hundreds of kilometers towards their hometowns. And this particular event was reflected in various texts. And I have taken three different texts for study. And I'm claiming that these texts, humanities as a response, cutting across genres, These texts become tools for moral communication by the ethical representation or critique of events. They embody what Ranjan Ghosh, in his book, um, Thinking Literature Across Continents, he calls hunger in literature. He brings out a concept of hunger in literature. And these texts also act as agents for empathetic engagement with the other. So the central concern of humanity is also the empathetic engagement with the other. So to this end, I look at 3 texts, all dealing with migrant laborers who were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers towards their villages due to the unexpected lockdown clamped by the government in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak in March 2020. The texts include an academic essay, The Long Walk, Migrant Workers and Extreme Mobility in the Age of Corona, by Pramod K. Nair. That is the academic piece. A journalistic piece, The Pandemic is a Portal, by writer-activist Arundhati Roy, who explores the various aspects of the corona lockdown on various sections of society, and an anonymous poem which was published in the Quint, and it was titled What I Didn't See, a poem for the migrant laborer of India. Texts as moral communication. As part of the moral communication process, an allegation which rises especially against academic writing is that it seems to exoticize the other by approaching and engaging with it from a safe distance. Theorists like Natasha Eaton and Krista Nelwolf argue that the exotic, or the other, is best consumed from within safety and detached from its original context that may be wild and unruly. In full agreement, Nair remarks, the literary exotic is a diegetic space. It enables us to encounter the other world, but without the messiness of living in it. As such, literature is the safest mode of encountering the other world and its inhabitants. On a superficial level, this sounds like a very safe option, but Ranjan Ghosh, in his book, Thinking Literature Across Cultures, he legitimizes the argument against exoticization by contending that Sahitya, or literature, has the ability to operate beyond the point of a direct act of perception. Its creation and consumption sans direct perception is acceptable. Now, Pramod Nair, while describing the travails of the laborers in his essay with a pungent touch, uses terms like carceral imagery, extreme mobility under an immobility regime. Ironically, the agentic coordinates for extreme mobility, the fact that these migrant laborers had to walk hundreds of kilometers, he's calling that extreme mobility, consist of utter helplessness and desperation. They had no other way. That is why they undertook this journey. When he adds, migrant workers across the Indian metropolises are always already in a hyper-incarcerated mode. Now, I wouldn't call it academic objectification or exoticization, but feeling the suffering of distant humans on par with the suffering of proximate ones. Arundhati Roy makes an analogous statement to Nair's in her journalistic piece. As they walked, I quote, as they walked, some were beaten brutally and humiliated by the police who were charged with strictly enforcing the curfew. Young men were made to crouch and frog jump down the highway. Outside the town of Bareilly, one group was herded together and hosed down with chemical spray. Now, this is the irony. They couldn't stay inside. They didn't have food, etc. So they were forced to undertake a journey. And when they went outside, the police is actually beating them up, saying that you are, breaking the curfew. So this is the situation which is brought out by Arundhati Roy and Nair, Pramod Nair. In a different key, the poem expresses strong emotion evoked by a visual on TV. Now, this poem, which was published in Quint, as I said, it shows the visual of the migrant laborers they are running, and you have a poem which is said as a voiceover. What did I see? I quote from the poem. What did I see in the videos of migrant laborers fleeing cities? Blue skies, tall buildings, wide shining roads, green trees. It's all so beautiful. my magnificent India. What did I not see in these videos? Helpless and ugly poor, tired of the city, running hungrily towards their villages. This means that even if the video was about the fleeing migrant laborers, they somehow got relegated to the background in the eyes of the spectator. The spectator didn't really see the running migrant laborers. The spectator only saw the background, the trees, the buildings, magnificent India, so to say. One of the reasons for the charge of exoticization is a paradox of aesthetics and the dissemination of the outsider's predicament. Elaine Scarry suggests that if the aesthetic of beauty of human beings, nature, objects generates the desire for replication and the production of more beauty, then that literature which points to the destruction of such beauty, as in the narratives which map dehumanization, may generate the ethical hunger to demand a return to beauty in various parts of the world. So these narratives of dehumanization, it is actually a kind of counter aesthetic which maps dehumanization and it fulfills the ethical hunger to demand a return to beauty. So anything which is removing that beauty, anything which is destroying that beauty, this representation is a call for return to the original beauty. By bringing out their suffering and publicizing the predicament, Nair's text can be read as an ethical aesthetic demand for more just social arrangements. That is what humanities is doing. The paradigm of heroic stuckness, I quote from Nair, the paradigm of heroic stuckness that frames the conditions of the migrant workers expects them to endure and prevail in most horrific of conditions, no wages, no food, no jobs, and a virus on the move. Roy, too, highlights the injustice when she says, every one of the working people I spoke to was worried about the virus, but it was less real, less present in their lives than looming unemployment, starvation, and violence of the police. The poem, it prods the reader's conscience by pointing the finger inwards. These homeless are probably baseless, without data, hence invisible to me. So the implication here is that only those people who have a document, only those people who have a data, only those people who matter, they are the only ones who become visible. Otherwise, these people become invisible, even in a video which featured them running towards their homeland or home. So these three texts, by a paradox of aesthetics, lay bare the loss of human dignity by mapping the dehumanization in this particular context, resulting in the restoration of that dignity. So I'm arguing that in a way, by mapping dehumanization, these texts are in a way restoring the dignity of the individual. Thus, the piece is written detached from their original context. So all of them were not done in the original context. They were definitely detached from the original context. They do not in any way diminish in their ethical, political, or emotional value. They are not objective or distant or an exercise in literary, political, or academic exoticization. They are exercises in communication aimed at prodding the reader's conscience about the other by an ethical aesthetic representation of events. Now I'll come to the second point, and the point about hunger of literature. Coming to the second point, what is meant by hunger in or of literature? Ranjan Ghosh posits the ethics of Sahitya or literature as inscribed in a variety of hunger to explicate the ways of human experience and engagements with emotion. So basically, humanities is about human experience and engagement with human emotions, and how human emotions are sometimes manipulated for gain of many kinds. He adds, I quote, for me, this aesthetic of hunger in Sahitya is about forming, foregrounding, and fictionalizing the other. So this is again the concern of humanities, engagement with the other. Ghosh also vouches for the ineliminable hunger in Sahitya to evolve greater modes of meaning and deeper enclaves of sense. He adds that the literary capital built out of such transcreative hunger has its own power and politics of insertion, interference, and assimilation. Hunger inspires recycling, reimagining, and recombinatory energy. So, whether it's an academic essay, whether it's a poem, a work of fiction, whether it's a journalistic piece, it embodies this particular hunger, and that is why these events are recycled, reimagined, and a recombinatory energy is released. This hunger to explicate a dire human experience is refracted through the intellectual prism when Nair says that the event in terms of um, hyper incarceration, stuckness, and extreme agency. He says that the ones who are stuck have simply to wait it out or wait for the crisis to blow over. This recycling and reimagining of an event can be seen as recombinatory energy. It also resonates with Judith Butler's comments on the spurious distinction between grievable and ungrievable lives, that is, those who should be protected against death at all costs, and those whose lives are considered not worth safeguarding against illness and death. We have seen this segregation in many of the countries. Some people, some groups of people, they are important. They should have access to medical care. They should have access to all the important things. And there are other groups of people from whom this medical care and all other help is withheld, or no actual efforts are made for this help and medical care to make it accessible to certain groups of people. And these differences are being critiqued, interpreted by humanities through all these texts. This diminished value of human life is echoed in the concluding lines of the poem. Since now there is no rally, they are unimportant. So these migrant workers are called unimportant. They are important only for political rallies or as vote banks. So as long as there is no context for a political rally or a vote bank, they are completely insignificant. This kind of inequality is not exclusive to India, obviously. It is also seen in developed nations in what Sean Oseosu calls the politics of disposability. He states in his Boston Review article, systemic social inequalities have made some groups more vulnerable than others, like people with disabilities, racial minorities, elderly, the undocumented immigrants and prisoners. The cultural critic Henry Giroux analyzes this politics thus. It's a politics which the unproductive, that means the unproductive people are the new marginalized. I mean, they are among the marginalized. The poor, the weak, and the racially marginalized, they are considered useless and therefore expendable. So you have groups which are divided into expendable and the useful. This disposability is thus expressed by Nair in his work, in his essay. For the migrant workers, staying on in New Delhi was not an option since their wages had stopped and there was no work to be found. The lockdown proscribed all movement. Roy brings to light the expendable plight of the migrant laborer under lockdown, who also happens to be the other. Many driven out by their employers and landlords, millions of impoverished, hungry, thirsty people, young and old, men, women, children, sick people, blind people, disabled people, with nowhere else to go, with no public transport in sight, began a long march home to their villages. Some died on the way. Thus, by bringing the plight and predicament of the migrant laborer to light, these texts, they practice the politics of interference and evolve deeper enclaves of sense and meaning. And I argue that these texts thus fulfill the hunger of literature as a responsibility towards the other. Now I come to my third point, that is the empathetic engagement with the other. The third point is about literature's empathetic engagement with the other. The literary text engages with otherness in an attempt to sketch the other's life world through the seeds of the ethical, political, and the emotional. Jeffrey Galt Harpum states that the humanities in general and literature in particular are a genre that seems especially committed to the exploration of outsiderhood. He reckons that the urge of thought to fulfill its obligation to the other, the outsider, manifests itself in other than thought. The three texts express their commitment to ethical explorations of outsiderhood. The leaders and policymakers, while clamping the lockdown, completely ignored the plight of the daily wage earners and the poor, who happen to be others and outsiders. Nair in his essay says, when immobility regimes such as the lockdown are put in place, there is a significant segment of the city's population, the floating migrant workers for whom a whole new regime is instituted. Roy pours out her indignation at the travails of the migrant laborers thus. Our towns and mega cities began to extrude their working class citizens like so much unwanted accurate. And the poem, pointing to the invisibility of the migrant laborer, even in the video featuring their exodus, says, what did I see in the videos of migrant laborers fleeing cities? Blue skies, tall buildings, wide shining roads, green trees. It's all so beautiful, my magnificent India. And we see here a moral communication at work when the poem talks about the invisibility, inaudibility, and the insignificance of the fleeing masses. But the compass points at the reader or the listener who shuts himself off from the predicament of the other. Roy further says in her article, she quotes a fleeing man thus, maybe when Modi ji decided to do this, nobody told him about us. Maybe he didn't know about us. And Nair speaks about the state of precarity in which the migrant workers' lives are lived. It consists of invisible practices of isolation and exclusion, since it is a condition of people whose lives do not matter. What I said earlier, these are the dispensable and lives which can be disposed of. Thus, these texts exemplify Nussbaum's idea of moral communication leading to moral perception and a moral imagination where the other is received and perceived through the empathetic identification. By prodding the reader's ability to miss less and to be responsible for more. This is done by foregrounding the other, playing out the politics of interference and assimilation, and also producing a recombinatory energy by reimagining and recycling and variously nudging and prodding the readers into seeing, hearing, and calling out for more just social engagements, thus embodying the spirit of hunger in literature. And I must say that we have seen the result of the politics of interference which was played out by these texts when as soon as some movement was possible, the governments made arrangements for the travel of these migrant laborers before bringing back the more privileged people from abroad, etc. So trains were arranged, etc. So some response was there from the government, some response was there from the policymakers to address the predicament of these migrant workers. So when a kind of when the politics of interference is played by humanities, it does have some kind of an impact. That is my argument. Obviously, the problem was not fully addressed, but at least there was a partial intervention. So I would say something is better than nothing. Can we have the next slide, please? So these here I have so far I have talked about the three texts which dealt with humanities and which was a response of humanities towards the events which are taking place. Now I come back to the larger question, and once again I come to the general reflection by some scholars. Now this one is by Judith Butler. She is talking about the pandemic situation. On one hand, we are asked to sequester ourselves in family units, shared dwelling spaces, or individual domiciles deprived of social contract and relegated to spheres of relative isolation. On the other hand, we are faced with a virus that swiftly crosses borders, oblivious to the very idea of national territory. The question, so she also talks about, which I have already addressed here, she also talks about the question of who will live and who will die is treated as a cost-benefit problem by some governments. And this is a question which sometimes the markets are deciding. I'm proud to feel that India has not taken that route and India has posed a very strong lockdown. And I think our policies have not been cost benefit driven. So that way we can be very glad. May I have the next slide, please? The next slide is also about Butler. How do we pose the question of what consequences this pandemic will have for thinking about equality, global interdependence, and our obligations towards one another? The bolstering of national policies and the closing of borders, often accompanied by panic, xenophobia, and the arrival of entrepreneurs eager to capitalize on global suffering, all testify to the rapidity with which radical inequality, nationalism, and capitalist exploitation find ways to reproduce and strengthen themselves within pandemic zones. Now, what I'm arguing is that humanities provides these perspectives. Otherwise, we will only have the narratives which is given to us by the states, the nation states, the corporates, the markets, etc. So an alternative or a counter narrative to these is being provided by the humanities scholars. May I have the next slide, please? This is also by Judith Butler. And she says, if only the rich will have access to the treatments as they are delivered, are we expected to applaud this radically obscene social inequality, coupled as it is with market rationality and American exceptionalism? So she is saying that the differences which are being played out, she calls it obscene social inequality. And in conclusion, I'd like to conclude by saying that humanities perpetually encounters a dilemma. If representation of violence and unjustness is done, one may be accused of exoticization, catering to voyeurism, and academic exploitation. On the other hand, to stay silent about violence is tantamount to being complicit with it. If we remain silent, do we not further marginalize the already precarious lives? This is the inherent paradox of all works in human rights and ethics. Silence around these issues is read as ethical by some. I mean, hey, you should not show and write about the unpleasant things, so that it is considered ethical by some, but some others consider it complicity with the evil or the bad or whatever. However, isn't literature the fuel on which activism lights its fires? And policymakers are compelled to act and retract, at least occasionally. Can't humanities research and writing influence practices, policies? Does it not impact and shape the public pulse and its social cultural thinking? So should humanities and literature, driven by ethical hunger, not engage with the other just to avoid controversy? And I would like here to echo Martha Nussbaum's concerns, which comes in the next slide. Everywhere, greed and narcissism contend against respect and love. All modern societies are rapidly losing the battle as they feed the forces that lead to violence and dehumanization and fail to feed the forces that lead to cultures of equality and respect. Can we have the next? Yes, right. If we do not insist on the crucial importance of humanities and the arts, they will drop away because they do not make money. Everything is being measured and evaluated in terms of money. So if we do not insist on the crucial importance of humanities, there is a danger of humanities dropping away because they do not directly translate into money. Next slide, please. And they only do what is more precious than that. So Martha Nussbaum is saying that humanities does something much more precious than simply making money. They make a world that is worth living in, people who are able to see other human beings as full people with thoughts and feelings of their own that deserve respect and empathy, and nations that are able to overcome fear and suspicion in favor of sympathetic and reasoned debate. With these words, I believe that I have demonstrated clearly that humanities is central to any discussion of precarious lives, suffering, and the other, especially in the context of the pandemic. It cannot and must not stay silent for fear of being accused of exoticization or any other allegation that is leveled against it. Humanities should be ever present to analyze, interpret, critique, and create representations and narratives built by nation states and corporates. If there is an ethical response at all possible in these troubled times, it must come from humanities research and writing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mini ma'am. And I'm sorry about the initial confusion
No,
because
no, no.
I got logged off. I think this is something we all have to
No,
anticipate when we
that
conduct
was that
webinars.
was fine.
Yeah. So you were listening to Dr. Mini M. Abraham from the Postgraduate Department of English, Bharatmata College, Kochi. And this presentation is actually part of our webinar series, Teaching and Learning Humanities in the Context of the Pandemic. The title of today's presentation was The Role of Humanities in the Context of the Pandemic. Now, let me say a few words about Mini Ma'am. This I was expected to do earlier, but this happens probably in webinars. Now, she's an engaged scholar and interested in a variety of topics from linguistics, Indian writing, cultural studies, literature, you name it, post-colonialism, and ELT. She's also interested in future studies, which you might have already noted. And she's actually a member of English Language Teachers Association of India and English Language Teachers Interaction Forum. She is a vibrant personality, as you might have already noted. She was the NAC coordinator of her college, Bharatmata, and is currently the IQAC coordinator. She's also the series coordinator of the ongoing Golden Jubilee webinar series arranged by her department. Of course, some of you might have already listened to some of those webinars which she had presented earlier. I think their webinar series is still continuing. More webinars are on the way. Thank you, Mini Ma'am, for this wonderful presentation. I think we can take questions now.
Yeah.
If you have questions, you can type it in the Q&A section. You will find an option there on the bottom of your screen. You can click that. Questions are in the Q&A option. You can type in your questions. So, Mini Ma'am.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, I can hear.
Now, what is your conclusion? Can humanities actually play a crucial role in promoting an ethical representation of reality?
Yes. That is what I have argued throughout. Humanities is playing a role, although the problem is that it is being devalued in schools, it is being devalued in universities, it is devalued wherever funding options are there, but still it is making an impact in the sense that these voices of scholars, even if these voices of scholars, it acts as irritants to many of the policymakers, it acts as irritants to many of the governments, and because it acts as irritants, they are forced to take some action wherein their policies are sometimes anti-humanistic and they are driven solely by financial considerations, etc. There are many instances wherein the governments, corporates, etc. They are doing an about turn and they are changing their policies. So I think it is because of the voices of humanities which are being aired in many ways, whether it is academic essays, whether it is journalistic pieces, whether it is the ubiquitous poetry which is circulating in the poetry and memes which are circulating in the media, social media, everywhere. So I think these are actually making inroads into policies. These are actually making inroads into the government thinking machinery. So yes, I think humanities is making an impact, although there are huge efforts to downplay.
Yeah, you have to remember that this is the age of post-truth.
Yeah.
So you feel that humanities can make a change. But Pramod, on the contrary, Pramod was, while presenting his webinar, the earlier one, he was, had a joke on this when he asked, will policymakers actually consult the head of the department of English here, or from Bharat Mata College, or from
Yeah, I remember Pramod saying that. I remember Pramod saying that if the government is making a policy, they are not going to invite the
the head of the
coordinator
department
or
of
head of the department of our colleges. But my point is this: when these voices are on TV, when these voices are in the digital space, at least it means that the common man has access to these views. And when the common man has access to these views, it helps in shaping public opinion. And public opinion is something that the governments have to take into account while making their policies. So they cannot work with entirely unpopular moves. So that way, even though there is no direct engagement with the humanities or academics, as Pramod sir said, but I think indirectly it makes an impact. So that's why I had argued that as far as the migrant laborers are concerned, before bringing, the people from abroad, and before bringing the people with agency, a little more agency than the migrant laborers, trains were arranged for these people to go to their native places. So that I consider as a proactive politics of interference.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you here. Minimum, can you see the question from our Q&A section?
I think there is a question from Devika. Devika says, what is the future of humanities in the digital online driven world that is coming? See, I would like to argue that although this is basically a technological and data driven world, what is the content being dealt with by the technology? Technology is used for, disseminating ideas. Technology is used so that more people can listen to more music, more people can listen to more, they can see more movies, and it is for communication. So it is the essence of being human, that is communicating with each other, playing out the love, expressing your emotion, addressing your boredom by listening to more music, more movies, etc. So the essence, the content with which technology plays, that comes from the field of humanities. So humanities can never ever be wiped out. So if you can have the platform for dissemination, but what will you disseminate? You will disseminate music, ideas, essays, songs, movies, and all this is the essence of humanity. So we have a future.
Yeah. We have more questions. Can you read it from your screen?
I can see Rohini Poti. I don't see Manoj. Can you read it out?
Yeah, yes. Has technological advancements caused for the degradation of human values? Is this connected?
Okay. Yeah. Has technological advancement caused a degradation of human values? See, the point is human beings have become somewhat slaves to technology. So if you talk in terms of, we have so many memes. We have so many memes wherein a drowning man is there and you have a crowd outside, taking the picture of the drowning man and not a single person giving a hand. So maybe, yes, to some extent, but that is one side of technology. I still argue that the other side of technology is that it is helping us keep up our relationships. It is helping us keep in touch, and it is also helping us to disseminate more ideas. That is the other side also. One side is, yes, possibly human beings are acting a little bit more like zombies, but the other side is, it is also helping us keep in touch with each other.
Which side do you feel will outweigh the other?
I am not a future studies scholar, although although I'm interested in that. I would, as an eternal optimist, I don't think it is stylish for literature people to be optimists, but I am an eternal optimist. I would like to feel that the human values will remain as long as human beings are there. Possibly they'll be relegated to smaller and smaller, smaller pockets, but it will not be wiped out completely. And I do believe that pockets of humanity, pockets of ethics, pockets of good, wonderful, nice, warm, these will remain somewhere. It will not be completely obliterated. No.
Yeah. Mini ma'am.
Yeah.
Meena teacher from Institute has already initiated a discussion on the topic.
Okay.
Now, she feels that cyborg universities will take over and will monopolize the whole scenario.
Yes.
What do you feel? Because only the universities and colleges who have the proper platform to implement online courses.
Yes.
They will monopolize the whole scenario. So what about marginalized sections of students, like from Kerala itself, we have the scheduled tribe.
Yes.
How far is this accessible to them?
Right now, if one takes a very dispassionate look at the scenario today, it does look like the digital divide is going to increase. It does look like all kinds of divisions are going to increase. And I also read in an article which was published, I think, yesterday, which was being shared on WhatsApp yesterday, that cyborg universities are going to take over. But see, everywhere I would say there are pockets of tradition. Everywhere there are pockets of, pockets of traditional modes of learning, and it keeps making a comeback in one form or the other. So yes, there will be an increase in the cyborg universities kinds of things that is going to be there, and the incidence of the private universities, that is also going to increase, because they will be the one with funding, and the public universities, they will always have a fund crunch, etc. Yes, but again, as an optimist, I would like to feel that the private universities will not completely swallow up the public universities, and we will still have these pockets of tradition which would be modified and which would be improved by tradition, which would be improved by technology, but there will be people who will maintain what it means to be essentially and quintessentially human. Perhaps they will not make a huge impact or a major impact, because even now we see that the whole world is data driven. The example which I want to give is, as far as UGC and NAAC is concerned, how do they evaluate achievement? UGC asks you, okay, how many people passed? How many got this much percentage? How many of your students were placed? And if your students were placed, how many of them got, what is the median salary? What is the highest salary? What is the lowest salary? What is the median salary? So it's almost as if gaining knowledge or gaining critical thinking, which is very difficult to bring down to numbers, that is being sidelined in favor of what is observable and what is measurable. So yes, there is a danger that, but let us hope, as teachers of English and scholars of humanities, that our faculty or humanities remains to spread sense, remains to spread common sense and balance in an increasingly disruptive world. That's what I hope.
Yeah, thanks. Now, thinking about the fund crunch that you just mentioned.
Yes.
Now we have a question here regarding the American publish or perish concept.
Okay, publish or perish concept. Yeah.
That's
as far as the publish or perish concept is concerned, I think our UGC, our government, in its new educational policy, it is trying to combat. It's trying very hard to combat this publish or perish.
The question is, how can academicians tackle this problem of fund crunch here? They have to continue doing their research. They have to publish.
Yeah. Let me.
The autonomy of the work will itself be influenced by this.
So, as I said, our government is trying to envisage 3 levels of universities. One is research universities, one is teaching universities, and one is, junior colleges. So, what the government is saying is that let the research universities do the research and let the junior colleges or let the colleges do the teaching. So, there won't be too much focus on research when it comes to the colleges. So this thought is still in the pipeline. It has not been implemented. So I think that publish or perish policy of the West, to some extent, our national government is trying to address that by, I'm not saying that the national educational policy is completely ideal, but at least it is making an effort to address this by saying that only the research universities, if you are a research universities, your job is to do research. So they will have funding, and the rest of you concentrate on teaching. What is the second part you had said, Manoj sir?
Yeah,
fund crunch.
Will this fund crunch actually influence the kind of autonomy of the produced work?
I am afraid yes.
Will the quality be affected?
I am afraid yes, because throughout the ages, funded research will have some kind of an agenda. Even now, when the government is trying to implement the IMPRESS projects, the STRIDE projects, they are focusing on what is called nationalism. And there are so many academics who are actually critiquing the government's notion of nationalism as being slightly reductive, as being quite reductive. So when the government is actually funding STRIDE projects and IMPRESS projects, etc., which do address the humanities area, it does address it, but the government seems to be having a certain agenda, a nationalistic agenda. Yes, if there is a fund crunch, it will affect the quality of research, and it will also affect the direction of research. Because as I said, when the government is saying you have to be nationalistic, there was a lot of argument about it. You have to be nationalistic means it obviously means that the screening committee, they will decide what kind of a proposal is adhering to the nationalistic interest, and what kind of a proposal is not adhering to the nationalistic interest. So those kinds of problems are there. And in the old days, we used to have these patrons for poets, singers, etc. So we can hope that we will have, if the government is not willing, the government is doing it within a certain agenda.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But we can hope that we will have a group of patrons, so-called patrons, or kind of modern day patrons, who will fund and finance genuine research in humanities, which will help us to interpret, which will help us to analyze, and which will help us to create new perspectives and paradigms in the new world. It will also help us to understand the world which we are living in.
Absolutely, man. The government will not be stopping all its fund altogether anyway. We have more questions.
In the post-COVID scenario, should our present syllabus be revised to incorporate subjects of more concern to humanity? Yes, that is what we feel. We feel that the syllabus should be revised, but then again, there is this trend of catering or pandering to the market trends. There is this tendency to pander to the market. So the market is only interested in people with a certain limited kind of skill, and concepts like critical thinking and things like activism. You cannot directly convert activism into money. So when UGC insists on outcomes, when UGC insists on measurable outcomes, and when the outcomes are assessed in terms of how much salary or how much money you made, this does become a problematic realm. Yes.
Thank you. Can you go on to the next question? Can you?
I couldn't quite hear that.
Can you go on to the next question? I think you can read from your screen.
Let me just check. How long can the traditional pockets hold on? So as far as the, see, traditional pockets have always been there. It's just that to what extent they come to the mainstream, that is a different question. Traditional has always been there, and traditional pockets will hold on. Whatever happens, traditional pockets are going to hold on. To what extent they will influence the mainstream, to what extent they will influence the mainstream in terms of money and impact, etc., that remains to be seen. But I do not see the complete obliteration of traditional pockets. I do not see the complete obliteration of religion. I do not see the complete obliteration of any of the traditional pockets in any area, including education. We will have, it's just that maybe less number of people will follow that, but then there will also be a comeback, as has been seen in many cases. Are there any more questions? I can't see any more on my screen. Let me just check. If there's any more, if you read it out, I'll try and address that. So I think I can't see any more questions. If there are any more questions, I'm ready to answer that.
Mini ma'am, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. I can hear you.
Okay. We have a question here.
Yes.
Regarding the minorities.
Okay.
This was one of your arguments.
Okay.
Which is a strong argument here in this case.
Yes.
Do you really think that literary works can influence higher authorities to consider the case of the minorities? We have a lot of literature coming out during the time, okay. And then during the post-pandemic times, more works will come out. Do you really think that these works will influence the authorities to consider the case of the minorities? Yes. What do you feel?
I think, see, it is not just literature. By literature, I don't know whether the person means fiction or poetry. My point is humanities, including fiction, non-fiction, journalism, everything. My point is that it shapes public opinion. So as far as the direct impact of a literary work towards changing a policy is concerned, no. The answer is no. It's not going to change. But the point is, these literary works, these journalistic pieces, they will go a long way towards shaping public opinion, and public opinion to some extent may penetrate the policymakers in making the policies. So it is not a direct intervention that I'm talking about. It is an indirect intervention that I'm talking about. Indirect intervention, which is brought about by shaping public opinion. And if the public comes out onto the streets and it is protesting against something, the authorities, to some extent, I'm not saying that everything is going to change or drastic changes are brought about, but then if you study history, all changes have started from the written word. All changes have started with the ideas being disseminated to the people. So that is how revolutions have taken place, and that is how revolutions are going to take place in future also. So as far as direct impact is concerned, no. But as far as indirect impact is concerned, yes. And I can see another question here. Does the politics of disposability affect illegal migrants? If yes, how? Definitely the politics of disposability affects illegal migrants, and that is why we have seen so many instances of suffering of the migrant laborers. First of all, the 3 works which I took, that happened sometime in March. So many people, they were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers. Then we had further examples where these people, a train hit them. Then they were beaten up by the police. All these things, it is happening precisely because they are considered disposable. And there are other groups which are considered disposable, that is the elderly. Now, that is not happening in India, I'm proud to say. So we are valuing human life here in India, but we see that in countries like US and Italy, etc. Now, this is what the news channels and this is what most people are saying. The elderly, the marginalized, the people who do not have illegal immigrants, as you mentioned, all these people who do not have the records to show the numbers, yes, they are being affected more because healthcare and other health that is not being made accessible to them, and that makes them extremely vulnerable. That makes their lives extremely precarious. Yes, they are affected. Is there anything else?
We have more questions coming up. Can you just scroll your dialog box?
Scroll up, I'm not getting Manoj. That's what.
Okay, I shall read it out.
Yeah, sure.
We have one from Lakshmi Menon.
Yes.
As you have rightly said, we are in a digital era of post-truth and quick dissemination of propaganda.
Yes.
Isn't public opinion largely being shaped by the social media platforms that are speaking to them on a more basic level and often moving the discourse into a government stance? What do you think about the influence of how far can social media platforms and the kind of discussions that take place there can actually influence the government?
Okay. Yes. See, it is true that social media is making great inroads into public opinion. That is perfectly true. But at some level, the people are also aware that most of it is really unverified and it is fake. And then many of the people within the social media itself, they are countering them also. So yes, the memes are shaping public opinion. The memes and whatever information is being circulated on the social media, that is definitely shaping public opinion. But at the same time, when people want to know authentic news, they do turn into the news channels, which definitely give more verified kind of news. So yes, they shape public opinion, and whether they reach the policy making coterie of the authorities, perhaps not, but then they do take cognizance of the fact that yes, this is the public pulse. It does give the public pulse, and in India we do not hold too many surveys checking the popularity of the current government, etc. Something which is done, I think, exclusively in the West. But then, if that is done, we will get a real idea about the public pulse, what the public thinks, what is the approval rating, etc., of the government's policies, etc. So, to some extent, yes, but as far as the authorities are concerned, maybe not so much.
Thanks for clarifying.
So now I can see some of the questions here. Even though humanities is the soul of the society, why is humanities considered inferior to science in many schools and higher education? See, again, I repeat, this is a data-driven world, and whether it's the government, whether it's the corporates, whether it's the nation states, everybody wants observable outcomes. Everybody wants observable output. And humanities cannot be reduced to numbers easily. The impact of humanities, it's not easy to reduce it to numbers. And that is why it is considered inferior. It's not considered inferior. I wouldn't go so far as to say it is considered inferior. People are more uncomfortable with humanities as a discipline in many schools and higher education. And what will be the scope of humanities in the post-corona time? See, I think the journalistic pieces are already here. The memes are already here. And the fiction, I think, is in the making. And we will have a large body of literature. We'll have a very large body of literature in the post-corona time, mapping all the emotions, mapping all the experiences of the human beings. That is, I think, forthcoming. Definitely, it's forthcoming. I think Alan Anthony's question, I think I had answered earlier. Has technological advancements caused for the degradation of human values? And I think I had answered that. How will the publisher perish? I think I answered.
Yes, you did.
Okay. Can you tell a practical application by citing some examples? Tumala Chandrasekhar. I think I cited examples. I cited examples of the migrant laborers when so many newspaper articles, when so many poems, when so much literature was actually written about the migrant laborers, the government was actually goaded to take steps to address their problems before it took steps to bring more privileged people from abroad. So I think that was answered. And Preeti Krishna, my apprehension is that will this new technologically enabled teaching learning process in the colleges dehumanize our classrooms? Very much so. I share your apprehension. You really cannot substitute the face-to-face interaction. And when we are having all this technology-based interactions, that is certainly going to, well, I don't know, should I use the word dehumanize? It is certainly going to reduce the passion and Kerala government, Nandu Krishna, Kerala government began to use the term guest laborers instead of migrant laborers. Is it accurate to identify it as a result of the positive engagement of humanities discipline? I would like to think yes, because so much was written about them. The government had to see, they were treated like guests also. They were given food and all those kinds of things. I think the Kerala government is doing a brilliant job. And I recently saw a clip being circulated wherein Pranay Roy of NDTV, he was interviewing our chief minister, and our health minister is also being interviewed. So the world is taking cognizance, the world is taking note of the way Kerala has been treating each and every section of its society, including the migrant laborers. Yes. Rashmi Girilal, but in the near future, technology will become accessible only to the wealthy and privileged section. Most of the services that we avail for free will be sold to us for money. Yes, you are absolutely right. Many of these educational platforms, they are making their services free for us during the corona time. And yes, it will cost lakhs of rupees just after the pandemic is over. Yes, you are absolutely right. Will there be a situation where the ones who get the technology now will be deprived of it in the future? There is a genuine danger of that. There is definitely a genuine danger of that. And as I said, it is definitely going to create more segregation, more separation, more digital divide. That is inevitable, and that is where engage in discourse in all these possible places. That is what they're trying to tell the government. Try to reduce the digital divide. Try to reduce the digital divide, and try to reduce all these inequalities, radical inequalities, which Judith Butler calls them. Steps should be taken to address those also. That is what our opposition is also talking about, but our governments are doing a good job. Do you think it is practical and effective to involve students in online learning for a long period of time during the pandemic? And will this type of study be as good as the traditional one? No, it will not be as good as the traditional one, because there are so many memes over it. I mean, you can sit in front of a screen and you can do something else, because sometimes your videos are switched off. If your videos are switched on, see, the teacher cannot gauge. The only way the teacher can gauge is if the student, submit some kind of an assignment or some kind of work, and that work we can. It's very difficult for the teacher to continuously trace whether the work is plagiarized or not. So definitely the online learning for a long period of time is not going to be as effective as the traditional one. But then we are in for it. I don't think we can escape it. So the only way is to adapt to it and make the best of it, because I don't think there is an escape from it in the very near future. And Tanya says, how will the new form of the student assessment be in the time of pandemic, where both in the same place or the same space? We already had this culture of multiple choice questions, which I personally feel that it is certainly not suitable for humanities at all. It is suitable for mathematics and sciences, but it's not suitable for humanities. But this is already there. I mean, even before the pandemic, this was there. And we all know, if most of you are teachers of English, You know that in the UGC, UGC NET examinations, we already have multiple choice questions which evaluate a person's knowledge of theory and which evaluate a person's knowledge of language. So that is fallacious to begin with, and that is not really ideal. But then I hope that when the humanities group comes forward, it will probably find some solutions for it. As of now, this is the transition stage, and the portents are not very good as of now. Do you believe humans can overcome their mental attitude crisis post-lockdown? People will have trouble. Already, the governments are officially addressing instances of mental health. So, since mental health problems are there, so this is being officially acknowledged that mental health is going to be an issue, and people will take some time to come back to normal. And we don't know how normal it's going to be in the post-lockdown times, because even post-lockdown, there are going to be a lot of restrictions, and because there are going to be a lot of restrictions, people will face difficulties, mental difficulties, emotional difficulties. Definitely, it is going to impact. It is problematic that the National Educational Policy's answer to publish or perish is to completely negate not only the existence of research in arts and science colleges, but also the existence of the said colleges themselves. Wouldn't this signify that spaces that have the potential to create critiques of the state would be reduced to merely trade schools? You are right. This is an anonymous attendee. This is something like, underemployment. There may be a lot of qualified people who are employed in these colleges, and those who have the potential to do great research. And yes, if national education policy is implemented to the word, this will certainly negate the existence of research which is currently existing in arts and science colleges. But then the other way of looking at it is the existing arts and science colleges, they can upgrade themselves to the level of deemed universities or universities, and then their research would be significant. So we can so one way of looking at it is that it negates the research. The other way of looking at it is that we can try and upgrade ourselves. How far can works of literature, this I think I had answered. Is the migrant laborer situation used by the media to mask the insufficiencies of the government schemes and implementation by giving it more screen space, and also to emotionally volatilize the general public into a state of apathy, which can be used to modulate political agendas and be used as a vote bank to the ideology of the political party? Yes, to some extent, yes. What you're saying is that there are other important issues which are being sidelined because the migrant laborer issue is given so much screen space. Yes, and that's part of my argument. It is the role of humanities to expose such hidden agendas of the hidden political agendas, the agendas of the corporates, it is the role of humanities and humanities scholars and teachers to expose all these hidden agendas and bring it to light, so that once again it can shape public policy and the people will be aware of the hidden agendas which are being used against them. I think Lakshmi's question I had already addressed. Yes. The last question I'm not able to read, Manoj. Yeah, what about the threat of misrepresentation and falsification of reality by a certain ideological hegemony, thus diverting the need of engaging with the impoverishment and imbalances obvious in the local, especially in terms of gender injustice? Okay, I did not address gender injustice in this particular talk, but yes, that is there. There is always a threat of misrepresentation. And I come back to my argument that it is the duty of humanities to teach critical thinking or disseminate critical thinking among the people, so that they they recognize misrepresentation. Now, what I'm talking about possibly can be an ideal state of things, but that is what humanities can aim to equip people to recognize misrepresentation and falsification of reality, and the ideological hegemony which is trying to spread these kinds of misrepresentations. And yes, so hegemony works on diverting the attention of people towards something which is not important. So the role of humanities is to foreground what needs to be foregrounded once again, and to get the attention of the people back to what is important, and to expose the tricks, so to say, the semantic tricks, I would say, of the powerful people, so that they do not impoverish people. And yes, as far as gender inequality is concerned, that is again part and parcel of any event, I would say. Again, I repeat, by bringing it to light, by foregrounding the injustices, all the radical inequality, as Judith Butler puts it, only then we can create an awareness, and that is what mobilizes the change in society. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mini ma'am. That was a wonderful presentation, and you clarified all the doubts of our attendees. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have a lot of messages here of appreciation, lot of appreciation pouring in. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Now, now let me please invite Dr. Supriya to propose the word of thanks.
She's not audible. She's mute. Dr. Supriya is mute.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Mini. As we know, humanities is a discipline that requires constant revision and restructuring in the demands of the changing times. It has assumed an unforeseen dimension in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. And that indeed was the relevance of today's webinar. Dr. Mini has put it in the right perspective through her observations, backed by her readings of Pramod Nair, Arundhati Roy, and the anonymous poem. She has argued how even the narratives of dehumanization become ethical, aesthetic representation, voicing out the predicament of the voiceless and the invisible, as in the plight of the migrant laborers in the current scenario. So however much it is sidelined, just by virtue of its empathetic engagement with the other, humanities will make a world that is worth living in. It will continue to have its stay, as Arnold would put it, on the sustenance of humanity. On behalf of our college, IQAC, and the Department of English, I profusely thank Dr. Mini for insightful thoughts and lucid presentations. Thank you, Mini.
Thank you. Thank you, Manoj. Thank you, Department of English.
Just a second. I haven't wound up. Just a second. May I continue?
I'm sorry.
I also wish to, sure. I also wish to place on record our sincere thanks to our manager, Reverend Father Roldan Jacob, and our principal, Dr. Vincent B. Netto, for all the support they have given us. A word of special thanks to our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Shaiju, whose keen enthusiasm and initiative has been the driving force in conducting the Fatima webinar series. Equally worth mentioning is the technical expertise extended to us by Mr. Bridget Jacob and Dr. Sijin, who helped us go through this without any hitch. Our HOD, Dr. Cynthia Michael, has been diligently streamlining the whole procedure for the smooth conduct of the seminar. Thank you, Dr. Cynthia. Now about Dr. Manoj, the convener of today's webinar. He is one who keeps himself abreast of the latest developments, both in the field of literature and in the field of technology. A rare combination that is the need of the hour. Thank you, Manoj, for helping the department keep pace with the times. Now, a huge big thanks to all our students, current and former students. Happy to meet you all out there in the virtual space. It is your warmth that keeps us going on, dear children. I also thank all the participants for the interactive session, which actually made this a very fruitful exercise. I could hear the apprehension of the current generation about the future of the humanities. I think all that we have to do is to strike a golden mean between technological advancement and the preservation of human values. I think we can wind up on this note. Thank you, one and all. Over to
Thanks
Dr.
once
Manoj.
again.
Thank you, Supriya ma'am, and thank you all. Thank you, Mini ma'am, and all the participants. Cynthia ma'am, I think we can wind up the section now.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mini ma'am.
Thank you.
We hope to have another webinar soon. We'll keep you informed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.